Hello everyone, it's week 11 and we're now entering the very last unit of the class, which is going to be focusing on the poetics of the New Republic. And the person who will be focusing on this week is Ralph Waldo Emerson. You have probably heard of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and you may have even read some of his work before. He is a 19th century American poet, essayist, and he is also, if not the founder, then certainly the central figure of American transcendentalism. Emerson was also a Unitarian minister, at least he was ordained as a minister in 1829. But when his first wife, Ellen Tucker, died very suddenly and very horribly of tuberculosis in 1831, he gave up his ministry. He had also, in addition to that really traumatizing death, and it was traumatizing, Emerson actually tried to dig up his wife's body at a certain point. He was so lost to grief. But this crisis and other spiritual crises had led Emerson to give up the ministry. But when he had been a minister, he had touched very often and very deeply on the personal nature of spirituality. And this new sense of a personal spirituality is very much part of transcendentalism. And it also resonated with some of Emerson's contemporaries, with whom you may be familiar. Margaret Fuller, an extremely important force in the 19th century. Bronson Alcott, another very important force, and one of the founders of a utopian community, and of course H.D. Thoreau, who we will spend our last week of class with. The American Transcendentalists, and there's a little bit of a lecture on American Transcendentalism, so please just take this as barely touching on the theme, and turn to that lecture and also supplementary materials. But the American Transcendentalists all shared the belief that each individual could transcend, right, that is, move beyond, right, or overcome the physical world of the senses into a deeper spiritual experience through free will and also intuition. So you can also see, I think, if you think about American Transcendentalism, that American Transcendentalists are deeply influenced by the British Romantics. Emerson knew Wordsworth and Coleridge and Carlyle. He knew them personally, and he certainly knew their work. And we can feel in American Transcendentalism, although it is a very American phenomenon, that it has an influence, or it has been influenced by Romanticism. But in this school of thought, right, God is not a remote being, a remote unknowable being, but something that is inside of ourselves. Right? Emerson would speak of the divinity within each of us. And to understand, right, divinity, to understand God, means for Emerson to engage in introspection, right, to engage in a kind of interior searching of the soul. And he found that to do that for him, right, that a connection with nature was the thing that led him to that interior meditation, that interior searching. I think you could see possibly that it's not only British Romanticism that is an influence here, but of course an earlier American Puritanism with its emphasis on introspection and the searching of the soul. All right. So Emerson, I've said, is truly at the center of the American Transcendentalist movement. And the work of his that is at the center of that movement is a beautiful book composed in 1836 called Nature. And that book, Nature, really represents at least a decade, probably more than a decade, of Emerson's immersion in philosophy and religion and literature. It is an incredible book, an incredibly sort of condensed, but also very dense. Right? We can maybe emphasize the density of that condensing book about transcendentalism. I haven't assigned that work, but I have assigned two essays that in many ways draw on that work and perhaps even draw beyond it. The American Scholar and my very favorite, or one of my favorite essays by Emerson, the poet. The American Scholar was originally not an essay at all, right, or not an essay meant to be read in print, but it was an oration delivered before the Phi Beta Kappa Society at Cambridge in 1837. And since the function of a scholar, right, for when Emerson talks about a scholar, right, he's also talking about a student. So I assign this because you're students, right, and you're scholars, as I am, right, in the sense that Emerson means that word. But since the function of a student and a scholar, right, is intellectual in nature, Emerson began his talk with an explanation of the fundamental influences on the human mind. And for Emerson, those were three: nature, books, and finally, a distant third, action. Emerson saw nature as the first and most singular, important influence on human thought. And this isn't just kind of romantic, right? Romantic nature. What he thought was, because when we look at nature, right, what the mind does when we reflect on nature is to classify things. Right? Think about the sort of taxonomies of biology, right, that we might be familiar with, and we classify things in nature as separate from one another. But after we really become intimate with those classifications, right, after we know them very, very deeply, very intimately, our minds begin to see not just the separations, right, not just the differences between things that we originally considered different, but common patterns, right, a kind of unifying something, right, that is connecting everything in nature, and that renders further classification completely unnecessary. This is difficult, actually. Emerson's ideas about nature are not easy, and they're often misread, right? And Emerson is often thought of as just being some kind of nature lover. It's not really like that. It's a very difficult way of understanding classification, and then this intensity of classification that finally leads outward to a sense of wholeness. Okay, so you're going to see Emerson talk a lot about nature and talk a lot about how nature influences thought. The next influence is the influence of books, right? The influence of the past. But the past can only be transmitted to us through objects, right? An archaeologist, to understand the past, might look at a potsherd, right? And somebody literary might look at a book, right? So the past is transmitted to us through books and readings. And books are of extraordinary importance to Emerson, but he also understands that they can be dangerous in the wrong hands or used incorrectly. He says books are the best of things, well used, abused among the worst. And scholars, he believes, and he makes a distinction here, though, with scientists who he understands really have to attend to all of the scientific experimentations that came before. But scholars, in general, he says, should use books as inspiration, not simply as absolute authorities to be copied. For Emerson, the worst kind of an education was an education by rote, right? An education where you simply memorized everything that you were supposed to and then repeated it. That is not an education, Emerson would say. He would say, yes, we need to understand the past. We need all of that transmitted to us. We need to soak up that past through literature and through many other things. But then we need, right, to not simply repeat it, but to take a step forward from it. Write the book, right? Read it, but then write one. Then the final influence on our intellectual faculties, right, is action. And it's listed last for Emerson because it really is, as I said before, a very distant third to nature and to books. But Emerson did acknowledge that action was important to the thinker. And he even went so far as to say that the greatest value of action to the mind is like that of books, and better because actions can be a great source of inspiration to others. Now, it's very interesting, right? When you look at Emerson, and then we're going to end the course with Thoreau, how differently they approach this idea of action, right? And when we think about action, I want you to think particularly about political action, right? What Emerson says to us does have not just private ramifications for the way we live our lives, but it could very well have social and political ramifications. But you have to decide what you think. What do you think of Emerson, right, as a social, not only thinker, right, but as a social reformer? And when we think about social reformers, right, we usually associate social reform with action. For Emerson, though, I think maybe he's more of a social thinker, right? He gives us a way maybe to take action, but he's really leading us to that point rather than leading us past that point. Since you are all, by Emerson's definition, and certainly by my own, scholars, I thought it would be a good opportunity for you to reflect on your own thoughts about education, what it is, what is the nature of it, what does it mean to you, how do you think your own education could be improved, how do you think the system of education that we're engaged in this country at this moment in history could be improved. But it's Emerson's essay, The Poet, that will be our true focus for the week. And it's a beautiful essay. To my mind, Emerson's essay is really a poem, and a far better poem than any of the verses Emerson ever wrote. The Poet was published in Emerson's collection called Essays Second Series in 1844. And it was based on a lecture that he gave. And it was a lecture, not incidentally, that was heard by Walt Whitman in New York. And you're certainly going to see the influence of Emerson's The Poet on Whitman when you read, not this week, but next week, the preface to Leaves of Grass. Emerson first gave this essay as a lecture in 1842, and then it's published in 1844. It is an exuberant essay. It is also a deeply original essay. And in it, Emerson describes how the poet is representative, how he stands, and this is a quote, among partial man for the complete man. He is the only one, Emerson says, capable of articulating the transcendental nature of things, and the one who can identify symbols and emblems of the world. Emerson writes, "The world is a temple, whose walls are covered with emblems, pictures, and commandments of the deity. There is no fact in nature which does not carry the whole sense of nature." And what the poet does, he says, and I think this is a beautiful way of putting it, is reattach things to nature and the whole through language, through saying, right, or naming. But when Emerson speaks of saying or naming, right, he's talking about language. He says that the poet has a better perception, right? What makes someone a poet? It is having an acute perception, better than the rest of humanity. Emerson says he stands one step nearer to things and sees the flowing of metamorphosis. His speech flows with the flowing of nature. Notice how organic Emerson's language is, right? When Emerson looks at, when he says the word thing, right, he really means not a stable object, but a process, right? This thing that is always becoming, right, always in the process of becoming and transforming. In the poet, Emerson makes a statement that I hold very, very dear to my heart. He says poetry, good poetry, is not solely a matter of technical prowess, right? It is not meters, he says, but a meter-making argument that makes a poem, a thought so passionate and alive that, like the spirit of a plant or an animal, it has an architecture of its own and adorns nature with a new thing. That's quite an astonishing definition of what a poem is, or what a poet does. It is a thought, right? Someone who has a thought so passionate, so alive, that that thought is like a living thing, right? It's like a plant, it's like an animal, and it adorns nature with a new thing. A real poem is a new thing, not just an example of something that we have already, right, but a truly new thing in nature. Emerson observes, the poet speaks most adequately when he speaks somewhat wildly, not with the intellect. So it's not simply about being well schooled, right? But it's something that also, you have to have that schooling, but it's something also that breaks through from that, something ecstatic, right? Something wild. And the poets, Emerson would say, poets are our liberating gods. At the very end of the essay, though, Emerson tells us that he's waiting for some of these poets. There are not any of these poets, he says, in America, but he hopes that they will come. He says, America is a poem in our eyes. Its ample geography dazzles the imagination, and it will not wait long for meters. Walt Whitman is going to hear this call for the poet, and he is going to write as if he is answering Emerson's call. And when he writes Leaves of Grass, when he writes Song of Myself, that's exactly what he's doing. He's coming back to Emerson's definition of the poet, and he's trying to embody that definition. Read the poet. Read it closely. Read it carefully. Copy out passages that mean something to you. Emerson is of such critical importance. He's of such critical importance to the poets that we'll be reading, to Whitman, right, who we've read before in Drum Taps, but who we'll come back to Dickinson, and also to the poets that you may be reading today. We're going to end the course with Thoreau's Walden, and we will have come at that point very much full circle back to the spirit of place. I hope that you have a great week with Emerson, and I very much look forward to your posts on the poet. And I hope that there are poets among you, poets among all of us. Take care, and I'll see you very soon.